Thank you, Gino. Well, good morning and welcome to our virtual Flex Day. It was really nice to kick off the spring 2020 semester with our talented students. I want to give Speakeasy a big shout out, and I also want to thank Sean Fitzpatrick. What a great job. And as Gino said, it's really tough to record in this environment. And I believe they created that song themselves. So hats off to you. I'm really proud of you. Thank you. I'd like to give a special welcome to the members of the Board of Trustees and to our two new vice presidents, Dr. Jemana McGowan and Dr. Rick Rams. I know one of them is counting how many months they have in now, and I think Dr. Rams is up to counting how many weeks he has now. So welcome to both of you to your first flex at Citrus College. I know we'd like to be back on campus and functioning in our usual way. However, I'm glad we can still connect and continue in a way that ensures our health and safety. I hope you'll join me in extending a big thanks to our Flex Day Committee, the Faculty Learning Institute, and I'm going to call them the Classified Development Committee, Gino. Thank them all for all their efforts with today's program. They've done a great job. As we get ready to dive into the spring semester, I want to thank each of you for your resilience during this pandemic. I know that it's been a lot to juggle along with other life responsibilities and other challenges. Nevertheless, I thank you for your efforts, your innovation and dedication. We've been able to keep the virtual doors to Citrus College open with few bumps in the road, and it has been done through a concerted effort. So thank you to you. As some of you may know, I like to do jigsaw puzzles, several thousand pieces if I can find them. And if doing puzzles teaches me anything, is that every puzzle piece is critical. To me, if I just happen to lose one puzzle piece, usually due to my inadvertent, diligent vacuum cleaning in the vicinity of my masterpiece, I won't continue the puzzle. Likewise, our masterpiece, a successful Citrus College, is dependent upon the participation of every member of the Citrus College community. So once again, I extend my thanks to each of you for making it go right in these trying times. Well done. While I know my role today was to welcome you, I do want to share some highlights of the upcoming spring semester. First, and critical to the future direction of the college, is the upcoming new strategic plan. We're now in the fifth and final year of our current strategic plan, and it's really hard to believe that close to 5 years have already gone by since we developed the plan. And I'm really pleased to tell you that almost after a year of conscientious work, our 35-member strategic plan work group is on track to complete a draft of the new 5-year plan, which will begin in the fall. This semester, they'll reach out to you, they'll invite you. We want your feedback. We want your input on best ways to carry out the plan. So take advantage of the opportunities to be part of the institutional dialogue as we plan for the next 5 years. Second, as you all know, Citrus College is committed to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. In June 2020, the members of the Board of Trustees passed a resolution. Their resolution had a call to action to address structural racism. As a result, we formed a 27-member Citrus College Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force, and we began our work in the summer of 2020. The early meetings of the task force included training to develop shared understanding and a shared vocabulary. Now the task force is doing a thorough review of all board policies and administrative procedures from a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. As the task force continues its work beyond the review of board policies and procedures, the next stage will include an assessment of college plans, the curriculum, the campus environment, student outcomes data, the college's recruitment, hiring, promotion practices, the support services provided to students, and the training of the college community in regard to diversity, sensitivity, and cultural awareness. Their work will culminate with a gap analysis of the areas assessed. I want to thank the members of the DEI task force for their commitment to the charge and for their dedication and hard work. I especially want to commend and thank the co-leads of the task force, Ms. Nikawana Shaw, Dr. Dana Hester, and Dr. Lan Howe. I know we're all looking forward to today's general session with Dr. Frank Harris III, who will speak on advancing equity and justice on campus. Next, I want to give you a status update on our accreditation cycle, the A word. After much work by members of the college community under the leadership of Dr. Arvid Spoor, Ms. Katie Bessancone, and Dr. Dana Hester, we completed our institutional self-evaluation report and submitted it to the commission in early January. What a relief. I thank each of you who served on an accreditation standard committee for your contributions. Right now, the accrediting visit team is in the process of reviewing our report. We expect that they'll be providing us with some feedback by the end of next month, and that will give us the opportunity to gather information and provide clarification they require prior to the virtual site visit in October 2021. I'm confident by this time next year, Citrus College will have already learned that it has received a 7-year reaffirmation of accreditation. And next, I want to thank the members of the COVID work group led by Dr. Robert Samus. He and Dr. Shauna Bigby have been working with the COVID work group to inform, support, and guide the college community. They've been steadfast in their efforts to remain in close communication with the Los Angeles Department of Public Health and to track all new developments from the state, and there are many. Today, you'll have the opportunity to hear from Dr. Samus and Dr. Bigby as we work to develop plans for a phased-in return to campus. Despite the challenges we faced this past year and the significant changes the college has undergone, Citrus College quickly mobilized to educate and support our students. I have to say, I've been amazed by the way each of you has persevered over the past year, a true testament to the Citrus College spirit. I want to thank you for your efforts in supporting students and keeping Citrus College up and running. I hope you find today's sessions to be informative, motivated, and insightful. And I wish you a smooth and rewarding semester. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. Before we begin our morning session, we would like to go over a couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, please make sure you're displaying an accurate profile name for record keeping. To rename, you can click the 3 dots at the top right of your profile box. We will be conducting a breakout activity during the presentation. Participants will be randomly placed into breakout rooms. Video is optional but encouraged. Last, please make sure you're muted during the presentation, but plan to unmute during the breakout session. To unmute, click the button on the bottom left of your desktop.
Without any further ado, I would like to introduce our morning speaker, Dr. Frank Harris III, a professor of post-secondary education and co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab at San Diego State University. His presentation is titled Advancing Racial Equity and Justice on Campus, Aligning Culture and Strategy. Welcome, Dr. Harris.
Good morning, Citrus College. Thank you so much, Professor Bosler, for the wonderful introduction. I'm humbled and honored to be here to lead what I think is a very important conversation at such a critical time in our country's history. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the colleagues who I got to work with over the past, I guess it's been 6 or 7 months since we began our conversations and started to really envision what we wanted today to be like and what we were hoping that everyone would gain from this conversation. And those colleagues, many of them have already been named, but I'm going to go ahead and name them again. Professor Sarah Bosler, Dean Eric Rabatoy, Professor Nicole Airy, Professor Nikiwana Shaw, Caroline Tippins, Bob Hughes, and several others who I'm sure weren't necessarily in our meetings, but played an important role in making this day happen today. I don't know if there are any Board of Trustee members who are present, but if so, I would like to thank and acknowledge them for their leadership. And finally, a big thank you to Dr. Perry. I understand that this is her last convocation, and I want to make sure that I do whatever I can do to make it the best and the most memorable one. So Dr. Perry, thank you for providing this space and platform for us to have this conversation. But more importantly, congratulations on a distinguished career as an educational leader. And we wish you much success in whatever you have going moving forward.
Thank you.
Yep. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slide deck that I've prepared for today. as I do this, I will say that, one of the questions, I think the question that I get most often whenever I have the opportunity to speak is, will I be willing to share the slide deck? So I want to first acknowledge that I will be happily glad to do so. I'll make sure that the slide deck is available for anyone that wants to reference the materials after, or if someone has some other need or pressing need to have them, I'll make sure that they're available. As Professor Bosler shared, the title of my talk today is Advancing Racial Equity and Justice on Campus, a call to action for all educators. And the goal is for me to spend the first half of our time together really establishing the context, talking about some core concepts related to racial equity, just giving us some information and insights that we think are critical and necessary as educators to be able to contribute to advancing racial equity, regardless of what your respective role at the college may be. From there, we're going to do our breakout sessions that Nicole mentioned, Professor Ari mentioned, and then some of the content that you'll be engaging in the breakout sessions will come from this first half of the presentation. After the breakout sessions, we'll reconvene and where we're going to offer what I'm calling a call to action for all educators. So that's what we envision. We hope that everything goes as planned, and we appreciate everyone's, again, participation and engagement today. So before I delve in and get started, I first want to acknowledge that I am joining you from occupied Kumeyaay land in the San Diego region of California. And of course, this is a land that has protected us, healed us, nourished us, and has inspired us for generations and continues to do so. I would like to share my social media platforms. If anyone wants to tweet or post pictures or share thoughts and reactions, I welcome you to do so by way of Instagram or Twitter. And that being said, what I would like to do is start by sharing the 3 objectives that we have prepared to inform today's conversations. First, we're going to talk about issues of racism and racial equity and why they impact the experiences and success of disproportionately impacted students in community colleges. I'm going to talk about what exactly disproportionately impacted means and which students are typically disproportionately impacted in our community colleges. We're also going to talk about institutional barriers that despite our best efforts, make it difficult to close racial equity gaps. Why is that the case? And then finally, the strategies are going to be a core part of our call to action today. I also think it's really, really important to acknowledge that, some of the things that are going on in our socio-political context that have some impact on our work as educators. We all know, and this has already been referenced a couple of times today, that we're in the midst of a global pandemic that has actually killed more than 400,000 people in the United States. And we know that there are certain communities of color that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, whether it be infection rates, death rates, or as we can see more recently, access to vaccines. We also have experienced a racial reckoning and awakening in 2020 that was sparked by the tragic murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Elijah McClain, and Tony McDade, to name a few. We find ourselves in the midst of a declining economy that has substantially impacted the service industries. And the reason why I highlight the service industry particularly, because we know for decades, the service industry has really been a key employer for college students, right? The service industry allows students to a flexible work schedule so that they can attend college part-time or attend in the evenings or whatever it may be. And so when we have declines in the service industry, we can expect that it's going to have some impact on our students and the wages and the financial resources that they need, being able to earn the financial resources that they need to attend school. We participated in one of the most intense election seasons in the history of our country, and that has certainly has some impact on our social political climate. And then not long after that, there was an insurrection at the Capitol, which, and from my perspective, was fueled by white supremacy. And we're trying to do all of this and manage all of these issues while running our campus remotely, right? Which is, a year ago, we could not have imagined having to do that, but that's what we're doing. And so I think all of these issues in this context, again, really underscores the importance of our work as educators, and more specifically talks about and underscores the reasons why we need to approach our work as educators through the lens of equity and equity mindedness. And when we talk about equity, I never like to have a conversation about equity without first and foremost defining that concept and being very clear and transparent about what does it mean from my perspective and how do I operationalize it in my work. Equity at its core is about enacting intentional strategies to address disparities that impact students who experience disproportionate impact, meaning students who are not benefiting as much from their participation in post-secondary education as other students. We know from our work that there are certain groups of students that no matter how we disaggregate our data, no matter what student success metrics we're looking at, there are certain groups of students that show up as consistently disproportionately impacted on almost every indicator of student success. What we see here is a small list. Two things to note here. This is by no means an exhaustive list, first and foremost. We know that there are other student populations that are also disproportionately impacted that are not represented here. A second point is that this looks differently within every context, within different campuses, right? So on some campuses, racially minoritized students, might be a population that's significantly disproportionately impacted. On other campuses, it might be Pell eligible students or so forth. The last point, and this is really important, is that we have to recognize and think about our equity work through the lens of intersectionality. What does that mean? We all know that we can have students who are racially minoritized, who's also a former foster youth, and who may also be a student with a disability. And so we shouldn't think about each of these groups that you see here, even the small number of groups that are represented here, as being mutually exclusive populations, right? So we have to think about this through the lens of intersectionality. Next, we cannot talk about equity without talking about what I describe as the linchpin of our equity work, and that is the concept of equity mindedness. Equity mindedness is the way in which we bring life and we bring action to our equity work as educators. It's the way that we make equity come alive in our work. And this concept of equity mindedness is largely credited to Dr. Estella Ben-Simone, who is actually a recently retired professor. She was at the University of Southern California for a long time and was the founding director of the Center for Urban Education. And Dr. Ben-Simone's work has been significant in really helping to shape equity efforts and equity policies, not just in California, but across the country. And Dr. Ben-Simone talks about equity mindedness as being primarily comprised of these 5 characteristics. First is that we have to recognize that inequity is not just something that we're struggling with in higher education. Inequity is a systemic issue. So the same students who are disproportionately impacted in our higher education, in the higher education sector, are also disproportionately impacted in our K-12 schools and so forth. They're also disproportionately impacted outside of the context of education, in the workforce, in our healthcare system, in our justice system. And so while we have to be focused on the context of education, and more specifically higher education, because that's the space in which we're working, and that's where our locus of control is situated, we also have to recognize that we really are dealing with a systemic issue, in that every social institution that impacts the lives of these students and their loved ones are not serving them well. Next, we have to be racially conscious and affirming. And I know, I would say by and large, institutions of higher education, whether we're talking about community colleges or even, four-year institutions, universities, and so forth, typically do not do a good job in creating spaces for folks to have intentional and productive conversations around race, racism, racial equity, and so forth. And we're going to talk about that as we delve further into the presentation. But when it comes to equity mindedness, we have to not simply see students' racial identities, particularly if they're racially minoritized, through a deficit lens or a deficit perspective. We actually have to see their racial identities as assets that can be leveraged to facilitate their success. And of course, we're going to talk about how we can do that as we get further into the presentation. we have to look, next, we have to look at student success issues through the lens of institutional responsibility and accountability. And that means that the first question we ask when we're engaged in a conversation about student success cannot be what's wrong with the students. Why aren't they doing what it takes for them to be successful here? We have to first start with questions about institutional success. And we have to ask questions about, well, what's wrong with our institutions? What's wrong with our programs? What is wrong with the educators who are charged with serving these students, right? And so the idea here is that as an open access community college, we really have to believe and understand that any student who's in our institution belongs there and has what it takes to be successful if we approach our work through the lens of institutional responsibility and accountability. And of course, we're going to talk more about that later. We also have to assume personal responsibility and accountability for student success. To put it stated simply, I have to see my students' success as a reflection of my effectiveness as an educator. And then lastly, we have to care deeply about students, their lived experiences, and their success. And given all that, it would be irresponsible for me to not at least acknowledge how the COVID-19 pandemic should influence our perspective on equity mindedness. And here I want to introduce the concept of digital equity. And digital equity is really about making sure that students have what they need to participate in this exclusively virtual remote learning context in which we find ourselves. And it's not 100% exclusively. I know that there's still some courses that are being offered, particularly in the CTE areas where students are able to attend. But for the most part, most students have to access their education remotely because of the pandemic. And of course, this starts with making sure that students have access to, a computer and to Wi-Fi. And I think colleges have done, at least the ones that I've had the opportunity to work with, have done a really good job of meeting this need. But it also means that students have to have the technological knowledge that they need to be able to seamlessly participate in these virtual learning spaces, be it for their classes or be it for access and support services, and not just participate, not just be there, but to really feel like they belong there, to really feel a sense of validation in those spaces, and to really feel like they can make meaningful contributions within them. And so our concept and definition of equity mindedness accounts for all the things that I just talked about, but also has to be, I would say retrofitted perhaps to acknowledge this current context related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And a last point here around racial consciousness. A key point in being equity minded is also being racially conscious. We're going to talk a lot about race today. And I hope folks are open to hearing what we have to say. And this is not to say that other forms of oppression and discrimination, systemic oppression and discrimination are not important, but what it does remind us that we cannot substitute race or overlook race in our efforts to achieve equity mindedness. And given all of that, I also recognize that some folks may still wonder, why should I care about this whole issue of equity, right? Knowing how to define it, knowing what equity mindedness is, that's an important starting point. But actually caring about equity is an issue in and of itself. And in addressing this question, I also have to acknowledge and recognize that those of us who see ourselves as equity champions or equity advocates, we haven't always done a good job of answering, responding to this question, or at least not done a good job in framing it in a way that would inspire all educators to center equity in their work. And so as a starting point here, I want to, offer what I think are 4 compelling reasons why all educators really need to care about equity. And when I say educators, I'm being very intentional in using that concept. It's not just, those of us who work with students in the classroom, from an instructional perspective. An educator includes, from my perspective, anyone that earns a paycheck to work at a college. Because whether you're a faculty member, whether you're a classified professional, whether you're a manager, whether you are a part of the custodial team at a college, whether you work in food services at a college, if you have the opportunity to interact with students, then you have some opportunity to influence student success in a positive way. And so when I talk about educators, I'm trying to be as inclusive as possible in using that term. But our first reason here is that we have to recognize that community colleges are the primary pathway to post-secondary education for students who are most adversely impacted by inequity in education. For a lot of students, many of the ones that we've already, talked about, if it not for community colleges, they wouldn't necessarily have a pathway to earn a degree or certificate, to transfer, or to be able to build their skills that will afford them employment in a career that pays a living wage and so forth. And so we really have to understand that the work that happens in community colleges plays a huge role in disrupting longstanding and systemic barriers to educational equity. Second is we have to recognize that the traditional paradigm of student success, the one that most of us have been socialized to embrace as educators, that really no longer works in meeting today's college students. We have a college student population that tends to enroll in college, not right out of high school, right? That tends to take several years, if not a decade or more, of time off before they actually make the decision to enroll in college. So we're talking about, critical mass of adult learners, a lot of students who are attending part-time while working full-time, students who have significant responsibilities outside of school, whether that is their employment, whether it's financial responsibilities. And so the traditional paradigm of what it means to be a successful student, or what a successful student looks, quote unquote, looks like, that no longer is the reality of the students that we have the privilege and opportunity of serving and working with today. And so we have to recalibrate our perspective of what student success is and how do we achieve it. I usually don't like to lead with this third one, but this third one is really about those who are more concerned with the economy and the workforce than they may be concerned about, some of these other things that we've talked about. But for about a decade now, the country's top economists have warned us that we cannot meet our country's social and economic needs without having a more college educated population. It's just not possible. And many policy advocates have said that we really need to be at about a 60% attainment benchmark, for adults between the ages of 25 and 34 years old. About 60% need to have some sort of college degree or certification. Well, it was predicted by the year 2020. We're nowhere near that. Others have said we need to be at 60% by the year 2025. We're nowhere near that. In fact, before the pandemic, we were not at our current rate of attainment, and this was again before the pandemic, we wouldn't reach 60% no earlier than the year 2048. And again, I think the pandemic and the impact that we know that it's having both on the economy and on education probably adds, at least several years to that prediction. And so when we have a country that's becoming more racially and ethnically diverse, we really can't afford to have a throwaway group, right? Because there are significant social and economic implications for all of us. And then finally, I think being an educator is the best job in the world. And it's also a career that comes with tremendous privilege, but equally tremendous responsibility. And so I say all of us that identify with being an educator, we have a moral and ethical responsibility to make sure that all students experience our campuses, our departments, our classrooms, our labs, our programs, whatever it is that we have some locus of control over, to experience them in a way that contributes to student success. Given all of that, I have had the opportunity to work with well over 100 campuses over the last decade in a range of equity related efforts, sometimes as working with them in coming up with good strategies to assess the status of equity at the college. Other times it's been more involved in professional learning conversations like the one that we're having today. At other times it's been about conducting applied research that can help inform educational practice and the development of policies and so forth. And what I've come to learn during that work is that achieving equity is incredibly difficult to do, right? Even when we have all the right information, and even when we're doing, all the things that the research tells us is important to do, are important to do, achieving equity is still really difficult. And so the reasons, what I offer here, or what I would say, a small snapshot of some of the reasons that I consistently encounter in my work with campuses. And of course, we don't have time to really unpack all of these. We could literally take the entire rest of our time together to do that. But I do want to highlight a few that I think are really important to talk about and center in our conversation today. And that's going to, perhaps have some influence on the conversations we have when we transition to our breakout groups. But let's start with the first one here that we see, which is the third on our list, deficit perspectives. In my experience, this is one of the most insidious barriers to achieving equity, because deficit perspectives are self-fulfilling prophecies. If we believe that a student doesn't belong here or is not capable of being successful, then believe me, it will have an impact on the ways in which we teach and serve those students. It will also be reflected in the vibe and in the energy that we convey, and in our motivation to go the extra mile to support that student. One of the most significant experiences that has informed my perspective on equity, and working with students from an equity-minded perspective, happened well over 20 years ago, when I was an adjunct professor teaching in the speech communication department at Los Angeles Trade Tech College. When I reflect on that experience, I like to say that those were my less enlightened days. But I can honestly say that the students who did well in my classes were, for the most part, the students who I believe would do well. And those who struggled were usually students that I didn't necessarily believe in, or necessarily went out of my way to support when they encountered difficulty. And so one of the key outcomes from the conversation we'll have today is that we have some understanding of how important our influence is and our perspectives are as educators, and how they have an impact on student success, maybe more in a much more direct and transparent way than even ourselves have recognized. Next is when we have a poor conceptualization of what equity is. Unfortunately, we have colleagues who really believe that equity is about lowering rigor and lowering standards. And so to counter that perspective, what I would like to say is equity is not about lowering rigor. It's not about lowering standards, because no one is well served when we do that. The student's not well served. You as an educator, you're certainly not well served, and the institution is not well served. But what equity really is about closing disparities in resources, disparities in information, disparities in opportunities. And what this means is that we cannot necessarily give every student the same thing, because that would be the definition of equality. But what we have to do is recognize what students need and give them what they need to be successful. And a big part of that is eliminating institutional barriers, the stuff that gets in the way, that limits a student's, makes it difficult for them to maximize their potential as students. And then finally, I'd like to spend some time discussing this last point that's highlighted and described as toxic resistance and toxic support. And in order to discuss this issue, I want to share a taxonomy that a good colleague of mine, Dr. J. Luke Wood, some of you may know him, but Luke and I developed this taxonomy a few years ago because we were encountering a lot of perspectives, a pretty broad range of perspectives on equity in our work with colleges and in our conversations with educators. And we felt like, we needed to have something that could sort of help us anchor what we were seeing and hearing. And we felt like this framework also helps to scaffold conversations that our colleagues had. Once we visited a campus, we introduced some concepts and strategies around equity. Folks needed to have something to kind of help make sense of the range of perspectives that they were encountering. And so you find here that the taxonomy essentially has two constructs. The first we can describe as competence, and it's represented at the top here with the labels know what to do and don't know what to do. And we can simply think about competence as an educator's knowledge and understanding of equity and equity-minded practices. So if I'm a classified professional and I'm working in outreach. I know what equity is. I know what equity mindedness is. I understand why they are important. And most importantly, I know how to infuse those concepts into my work as an outreach coordinator or whatever it may be, right? Whatever my role may be. Now, here's the deal, however. Knowing how to do something is necessary, but insufficient when it comes to actually doing it. And this is where our second construct comes in. And that we can, think about this one or call it motivation. And motivation is represented to the left of the figure, as you can see here with the labels, willingness to employ practices and unwillingness to employ practices. And so when we return to let's look at the box at the top right here that's labeled KW. This captures the perspective of educators who know what equity is, who know what equity mindedness is, and they practice it on a regular basis. And perhaps predictably, we call this group the choir. And we call this group the choir because on many of the campuses where we get to work, more often than not, it's the choir that's leading the equity efforts and conversations on their campuses. These are the folks that are out doing the professional development and bringing what they're learning back to their campuses. They're infusing these lessons into their work. They're infusing these lessons. They're bringing this perspective into hiring committees and using it to inform budget decisions and all sorts of things. Our next group are the allies. The only thing that separates the allies from the choir is that the allies have not had the coaching, the professional development. They just haven't had the opportunity to learn about equity mindedness and infuse it into their practices as educators. But if you give them the opportunity to learn it, they could just as easily become a part of the choir. The next group that we have are the resistors. Is the resistors. The resistors have not embraced equity mindedness and don't see it as necessary. And quite frankly, they're not motivated to do so. And we have found in our work that there are really two distinct types of resistors. The first are what we describe as active resistors. And these are simply the folks who are the most vocal and forthcoming about their opposition to equity efforts. So these are the folks who are saying, why are we doing this? This is such a waste of time. This is a waste of resources. Why are we so concerned about men of color? They represent such a small part of our population. Why should we care about that? The good news, perhaps, right? Some may see this as good news, is that most resistors are actually not active resistors. We found in our work that most resistors are actually passive resistors. Now, we tend to think that active resistors represent a larger contingent than they actually do because, again, they're very forthcoming about their opposition. But we have found that most resistors aren't going to necessarily be as vocal and transparent about their opposition to equity, but they're also going to avoid any opportunity that they have to be authentically engaged in it. And then we have the defiant. And these are the folks who have been trained, they have a good understanding of equity and equity mindedness. However, they refuse to enact equity-minded practices with students who need the support. At least, maybe they're willing to, be more intrusive or build relationships with students who look like them, or the students who come from their neighborhood, or the students who work in their research lab, their science lab, or the students who work as a work study in their department. But they're not necessarily willing to do it with the students who are disproportionately impacted, students who really need the support the most. Now, one time Luke and I was presenting this framework at a conference, and we got some feedback from a colleague immediately following the session. And he said, Frank, Luke, I like the taxonomy, makes a lot of sense. For the most part, it's aligned with my perspective and my experience, what I've experienced in my equity work with educators, but it's missing something. He said, what about the folks who think they're equity minded, who think they're a part of the choir, but they really have no idea what they're doing or what they're talking about? And so Luke and I reflected on that feedback and on that question and decided to add a fifth group to our taxonomy. And this is a group that we call the oblivious. And we call this group the oblivious because one can become oblivious in one of three ways. The first is when we approach our equity work from what we call a savior complex. When we believe that our work is about saving students rather than empowering students. And there's a difference, right? Saving students is essentially doing equity work or trying to do equity work from a deficit perspective, right? Those poor Black, brown students with disabilities, they need us, right? They can't do this without us. And we really have to think about equity work more so through the lens of empowerment, right? We're not here to save students, but we are here to identify the stuff, the barriers that gets in the way of their success, eliminate those barriers, and empower them to maximize their potential and maximize all the gifts and talents that they bring to bear. Second is when we're not reflective in our work. This occurs when our words and the values that we espouse are not aligned with our actions and the ways in which we teach students. So these are the folks who, when someone mistakenly says equality, they're the first to correct them and say, no, Frank, I think you meant to say equity there. Or they can tell you exactly what it means to be equity-minded, right? Or they can give you a laundry list of all the equity-related practices you should be doing to be an equity-minded educator or to be an equity champion. But when you look at the ways in which they're working with students, what they're saying and what they're preaching is not aligned with what they're doing. And then last is grandstanding. And grandstanding occurs when our commitment to equity is really more about developing a reputation for it or advancing our careers or being perceived a certain way by our colleagues than it is about eliminating barriers that impact students and student success. And so I share the taxonomy again for a few reasons. First is to help you and help others have productive conversations about where you may be or where a colleague may be when it comes to obtaining buy-in and support for equity efforts. Recognizing that the conversation you have with an ally, that's not the same conversation you're going to be able to have or need to have to get buy-in from someone who may be resistant or defiant. Second reason is that we also have to know where we are in this. And the fact of the matter is this, is that none of us are always in the choir. And I like to think that none of us are always resistant or defiant. But our perspectives around equity are probably more fluid than they are fixed. And there may be some students who maybe we are a part of the choir, right? And maybe we really are a champion. And other students where we have more, deeper, reflective, and intentional work that needs to be done. And so, given all of that we've talked about, right? And we've really kind of talked about equity, at this more individual, at the individual educator level. I want to share a short narrative that'll kind of help us transition to the next part of this conversation. And a couple years ago, I found myself incredibly frustrated with some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing with regard to equity. And I was frustrated because I was finding that there were some colleges that we were working with where they were making amazing progress when it came to equity, right? We saw, we saw that there were different conversations that were being had about student success. They were examining and changing policies and practices that contributed to inequity. They were doing a better job of assessing student success, through the lens of equity. So really engaged in what we would call equity-minded institutional research. They were doing all sorts of things that was showing that they were making great progress and great strides with regard to essentially institutionalizing equity. At the same time, there were colleges that we were working with that were doing all the same things that College A was doing, but they weren't experiencing the same level of progress. We didn't see the same tangible evidence of movement and success. And so I spent a little bit of time thinking about that. And I had what I would call a bit of an epiphany. And to be honest with you, I'm a little bit embarrassed to even call this an epiphany because once I recognized what was going on, it was, it should have been obvious from the outset. And I found that College A or colleges like College A were having much more success than colleges like College B, primarily for one main but very complex reason. And that being something that business mogul Peter Drucker advised us a long time ago, is that when it comes to institutions and organizations, culture eats strategy for breakfast every single time. I recognize that the reasons why most campuses, and I do say most, are not necessarily successful in institutionalizing equity is because we tend to focus too much on strategy and we don't do enough intentional work that's necessary to ready and shape our institutional cultures. So I want to spend some time talking about what that means and what that looks like. And in doing so, I'm going to share yet again another taxonomy. And I apologize to those who don't like taxonomies. I just find that as a researcher, taxonomies are just a really good way to kind of help take complex phenomenon and present it in a way that's accessible and in a way that's transparent and in a way that makes sense. Of course, the limitation is that sometimes taxonomies have a way of oversimplifying things that are incredibly complex. And so that's sort of, something that we have to balance and sort of trade off in doing this. But this taxonomy, as you can see, has two constructs like our last one. But these constructs are culture and strategy. Culture is reflected in many of the institutional elements that we see presented here. And I'll say this, by and large, our equity efforts do not address these key elements and factors that have a profound influence on the culture of an institution and ultimately a profound influence on the degree to which an institution can successfully institutionalize equity. Instead, most of our equity efforts focus on strategy, right? All of the things that you see here. And I will say this, strategy is incredibly important. It's very important to have strategies, right? We don't really do anything as educators and as institutions of higher education without having strategies. Strategy is how we move the needle in many respects. But the key point I'm making here is that we cannot ignore culture or overlook the influence of culture by over prioritizing strategy, especially in some of the early phases of trying to do something that's innovative and trying to do something that's intentional in institutionalizing equity. And so let's talk about this. Let's talk about what this looks like. I have found in my work that an institutional culture can either have an equity culture that is equity enriched or equity deprived, right? And of course, again, I know that, I'm sort of oversimplifying things a little bit. The fact of the matter is that no one institutional culture is always equity enriched, and no one's institutional culture is always equity deprived. And there's probably a whole lot more in between these two constructs here. So I do want to acknowledge that. But just going back to what we have here, we can have an institutional culture that's equity enriched or equity deprived. And I know some folks are thinking, okay, Frank, that all sounds good and fancy, but what exactly does an equity enriched culture look like? And what does an equity deprived culture look like? And so to give a quick snapshot of the difference between an equity enriched culture and an equity deprived culture, here's some examples of things that I have observed in my work with campuses. On the left are examples of what an equity and culture may look like. And on the right is what an equity deprived culture may look like. So for example, when we look at number 3, when we see equity as an indication of institutional responsibility, as opposed to being seen exclusively as an indicator of student performance, this might be indicative of an equity enriched culture. Let's take a look at one more. Let's look at number 6 here. We are perhaps equity enriched when we have campus leadership that is both transparent and unapologetic about the need and intention to prioritize equity, as opposed to being fearful or shameful about it. And so, again, there are 8 other examples that I'm not going to spend time, discussing each one, but just to highlight quickly some things that tends to be pretty cross-cutting in the work that I've had the opportunity to do with campuses. Now let's go back to strategy. And here's how strategy comes into play. I have found that we can either have good strategy or bad strategy when it comes to institutionalizing equity. As I was putting this together, I was sort of in between good strategy, bad strategy, or good strategy and no strategy. And I think I ultimately landed on, I've seen that I think it's better to have no strategy than to have bad strategy, because I've seen bad strategy do more harm than good. And so just based on the concept and the principle of do no harm, which we should all have as educators, I think bad strategy is worse than no strategy at all. But let's talk about what good strategy and bad strategy might look like. Again, here's some examples. Take a look at number 3. When I first got really deeply involved in equity work with community colleges and got really involved in doing a lot of professional development work, for the most part, the folks that I got to interact with were full-time faculty and managers, classified professionals, adjunct faculty and colleagues, our colleagues who may be, on the facility side of an institution, never got to participate in any type of conversation around professional learning or got to do anything to build their capacity as educators. Today we see, it being completely different, right? So a lot of the audiences that I get the opportunity to engage with are more inclusive when it comes to professional learning, and in some cases more targeted, right? And so there's sometimes where we see that, yeah, there's professional development and professional learning for faculty, but you also have intentional workshops and things that are exclusively for classified professionals and so forth. And so we've seen a lot of progress here in this strategy when it comes to using professional learning, which is a very important strategy to build equity capacity to institutionalize equity efforts. Let's take a look at one more, one that we haven't made as much progress on, at least in the times in which I've gotten the opportunity to work with colleges. Let's look at number 8 here. We have a long way to go in most places with this. But when we provide intentional spaces for folks to engage in difficult but necessary dialogue about race, racism, and racial equity, right? That is a good strategy. On most campuses, however, this conversation is often muted, unwelcome, and completely disconnected from conversations about equity. Now, I will say that I see a lot more progress here, post May 25th, 2020, when George Floyd was tragically murdered. I think that, again, that was an awakening for a lot of folks. And so I do see colleges being much more intentional in creating these spaces and just trying to be more intentional in creating an anti-racist institutional culture that is inclusive of strategies like this. But again, we have a lot of progress to make here. Let's go back to our taxonomy again, right? We can have an equity-enriched culture or an equity-deprived culture, good strategy and bad strategy. So let me tell you what happens when each of these patterns exist. So we can also, well, let me sort of go back. We can have an equity-enriched culture with good strategy. We can have an equity-deprived culture that's applying good strategy, right? And that's reflective of college A versus college B that I talked about earlier in setting this whole thing up. We could also, however, have bad strategy being applied in an equity-deprived culture. Of course, that's a place where no one wants to be, right? That's the least desirable state. And then finally, we could actually have an equity-rich culture, but where we may not necessarily be applying the right strategies. And I have found that when we have an equity-enriched culture and we're applying good strategy, we're likely going to see a lot of success and be very effective when it comes to institutionalizing equity. So equity is not going to just be something that you talk about, a couple times a year, maybe when you have a flex day, right? Equity is going to be a part of everything that is happening, everything that's important, everything that's significant at the institution, right? So it's going to be integrated, and you're going to see it reflected in conversations around curriculum and about budgeting and about strategic planning and about hiring, right? It's going to really be at the core of the institution. But when we have an equity-deprived culture, we could be applying the same strategies, but in an equity-deprived culture. And I found that in that case, everything you do related to equity, it's going to be external. It's always going to be something that's happening over there, rather than something that's happening and that's a part of the core of an institution, right? The core processes, right? It's got your efforts, you're going to find that they're always going to be externalized. But what happens when we apply bad strategy in a culture that's actually equity enriched in many ways? We're likely going to see some success here and there. We're going to see some areas where we see some evidence of institutionalization, but we're not going to be able to understand how or why it happened, and we're certainly not going to be able to replicate it in other spaces on campus where things might be a little bit more, equity deprived. And then what happens when we are applying bad strategy in an equity deprived context. Of course, again, we're not going to see any success when it comes to institutionalizing equity. Equity in many ways is going to be largely considered like a bad word at this, in this particular case, right? It's not something that anyone's going to embrace. And so some folks may be thinking, and I presented this whole thing through the lens of an institution. But this same framework applies to a division. The same framework can apply to a department or even to a program, right? And so we know that an institution, by and large, is a collection of subcultures or sub-institutions. And so the same interplay here between culture and strategy also applies at those, various sub-levels of a college. And so to further complicate matters, again, I have found that some campuses are great when it comes to institutionalizing equity for certain groups of students, but could be completely inept when it comes to doing so for others. And so what we have to do, and what this means, is that we have to be incredibly intentional and pay very close attention to the progress or the lack thereof in our efforts to institutionalize equity. For whom is it working? Or for whom is what we're doing working? And where do we continue to have gaps? Where do we continue to have areas and populations where we have to be more targeted and where we have to do a better job? Of course, disaggregated data comes into play. I'm going to, talk a lot about that on the other side of our breakout groups. Right now, however, we are going to transition to our breakout groups. And I want to give you an idea of some of the things that we're going to ask you to do. And then I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Sarah or Nicole. I can't remember who I'm supposed to pass the baton to after that. But they're going to give us some more direction about how do we, seamlessly transition into our breakout groups. But once you're in there, we're going to ask you to do a few things. First, we're going to ask you to introduce yourselves to your colleagues. So your name, your department, the position you're in at the college, and the month and day you were born. So for example, if your birthday is September 18th, just tell us the month and the date. You don't have to give us the year, unless you're inclined to do so. And the colleague whose birthday is closest to today, so closest to February 16th, is going to have the privilege and opportunity to be the scribe. And so I think now is the time. By now, I believe Bob Hughes should have put a link to a Google form in the chat. We're going to encourage you to open the link now. This form is what you're going to use, or what the scribe is going to use to record the group's responses to 3 questions that I'm going to share with you on the next slide. So again, to recap, get into your groups, introduce yourselves, including your birthdays, identify who the scribe is going to be. We're only going to have one form that's going to be completed for each group. So one scribe per group, one form submitted for each group.
Frank,
yes.
Dr. Harris, if you
yes,
would mind, don't share your screen anymore.
Okay.
Apparently the chat is not working. I'm going to go ahead and share a document that has the form link on it for everybody.
Okay, I am going to do that now. Bob, should I turn it over to you at this point?
Yes.
Okay.
So if we'd have everybody copy this down, take a picture of it or whatever, you're going to need